If you have spent any time near true crime corners of the internet in the last few months, you have probably already seen the headline, "The Zodiac Killer finally identified, 55 years after his last confirmed letter, and it is not the man almost everyone assumed it would be." It is a genuinely compelling headline, and the story behind it is real, in the sense that a real person made a real claim, and real news outlets really did report on it. What none of those headlines tend to mention, at least not in the first paragraph, is that the FBI has not confirmed it, the San Francisco Police Department has not confirmed it, and the Los Angeles Police Department, which would need to weigh in too because this claim reaches into a second infamous cold case, says its own investigation remains open. So before we get into who this new name actually is and why it has generated so much buzz, we need to talk honestly about what identity revealed actually means in a case that has produced this exact headline, with a different name attached to it, more times than almost any unsolved crime in American history. Let's start with what we actually, verifiably know, because the Zodiac case is unusual in how much real, confirmed physical evidence and correspondence exists, even without a name attached to any of it. Between December of 1968 and October of 1969, an unidentified killer murdered at least 5 people in and around the San Francisco Bay Area, targeting young couples parked in secluded spots, and in one case, a lone taxi driver. 2 other victims survived attacks and were able to give descriptions. The first attack came on a cold December night in 1968, when 17-year-old Betty Lou Jensen and 16-year-old David Faraday were shot on a secluded road outside Vallejo, California, on what appears to have been one of their very first dates. Both died. 6 months later, in July of 1969, the killer struck again in a Vallejo park, shooting Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau as they sat in a parked car. Ferrin died at the scene. Mageau survived, though badly wounded, and gave police a physical description that would shape the search for years. Less than a month after that shooting, someone claiming to be the killer called police directly and took credit for both attacks, then mailed nearly identical letters, each containing a piece of a coded message, to 3 separate Bay Area newspapers, along with a demand that the papers print the cipher, or he would go on a killing spree. That was the 408-character cipher the Hardens would crack within the week. 2 months after that, in September of 1969, the killer attacked again at Lake Berryessa in Napa County, this time in a bizarre costume. A black executioner's hood with a symbol on the chest matching his cipher signature, binding and stabbing college students Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell. Shepard died of her injuries days later. Hartnell survived and lived for decades afterward, giving investigators one of the only detailed physical descriptions from a confirmed surviving victim. The killer's final confirmed murder came in October of 1969, when cab driver Paul Stein was shot and killed in San Francisco's Presidio Heights neighborhood, with the killer tearing a swatch of fabric from the victim's bloodied shirt, and later mailing it to a newspaper as proof he was telling the truth. After Stein's murder, the killer never claimed another confirmed victim, though his letters continued for years, and his taunting correspondence with the press did not stop until 1974. What made this killer different from the thousands of other unsolved murder cases in American history was that he seemed to want to be caught, taking credit for the murders, taunting police, and eventually claiming, almost certainly falsely, to have killed as many as 37 people. He signed his letters with a circle crossed by a plus sign, the same symbol you will recognize instantly from 100 documentaries and true crime thumbnails, and he gave himself the name that stuck: Zodiac. What made this killer different from the thousands of other unsolved murder cases in American history was that he seemed to want to be caught, or at least wanted the game of almost being caught. Along with his letters, he sent 4 separate coded messages, ciphers, and dared the public and the police to solve them, at one point claiming that one of the codes contained his real identity. That claim, that his name was hiding inside a solvable puzzle, is the single detail that has powered more than 50 years of amateur investigation. And it is also, worth saying clearly, a claim made by a serial killer who spent his entire correspondence lying, boasting, and manipulating the people trying to catch him. He may have been telling the truth. He also may have been enjoying the idea of thousands of people spending their lives chasing a promise he never intended to keep. Here is where the real, documented cryptography comes in, because it matters enormously for understanding why the newest claim deserves a much more skeptical read than the headlines are giving it. Of the 4 ciphers the Zodiac sent to have been solved through rigorous, verifiable, peer-checked cryptanalysis, and 2 remain genuinely unsolved to this day. The first cipher, a 408-character cipher, was cracked within about a week of its publication in 1969. Not by police or the FBI, but by a schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty, working the puzzle by hand at their kitchen table using classic substitution. Cipher techniques. Their solution has never been seriously disputed. The second major cipher, a 340-character message, sat completely unsolved for 51 years. widely considered one of the hardest amateur ciphers in modern history, until December 5th, 2020, when 3 men on 3 different continents, a software developer in the United States named David Oranchak, a mathematician in Australia named Sam Blake, and a Belgian cipher specialist named Jarl van Eyck, combined their work, ran the possibilities through serious computational power, including a university supercomputer, and produced a solution the FBI's own cryptanalysis unit formally verified within days. It is worth sitting with how that process actually worked, because it is the gold standard against which every other solved-it claim in this case should be measured. Their methodology was published openly. Their working was checked by other cryptographers. Their solution was submitted to federal investigators, who ran their own verification before saying anything publicly. And even then, after 51 years of effort by 3 credentialed specialists working in full public view, the message that came out was disappointing in the most telling way possible. It contained taunts, boasts about being unafraid of the gas chamber, dark references to an afterlife of slaves. It did not contain a name. Even at his most encoded and most boastful, the Zodiac's confirmed, verified communications never once handed investigators the one piece of information his letters claim they might. 2 ciphers remain, to this day, completely and officially unsolved. A 13-character message referred to as Z13, and a 32-character message called Z32. And this is exactly where our new headline drops in, because the claim currently generating attention is that both of these ciphers have now been cracked, and that together they do finally reveal a name, and it is not a name most Zodiac researchers have spent much time on. Before we get to that new name, it is worth understanding who the old names were, because the title of this video promises you a name nobody suspected, and that promise only means anything if you know who everybody actually did suspect for the last 5 decades. For most of the case's history, one name has dominated the conversation more than any other. Arthur Lee Allen, a Vallejo schoolteacher who became a person of interest to investigators as early as the 1970s, after acquaintances came forward describing statements he had allegedly made that echoed details from the case. Allen was investigated extensively over the following decades. His home was searched, and his handwriting and typewriter were both compared against Zodiac's letters, though neither produced a conclusive match. He was later imprisoned on unrelated child molestation charges and died in 1992, still never formally charged in connection with the Zodiac murders. When DNA testing technology improved years later, investigators tested partial genetic material recovered from Zodiac's letters against a sample linked to Allen, and the results were inconclusive rather than a clean match or a clean exclusion, which is exactly the kind of unsatisfying, ambiguous finding that has kept this case unresolved and kept Allen's name circulating as the most famous Zodiac suspect for over 30 years, memorialized in books, documentaries, and a well-known feature film, without ever being definitively confirmed or definitively ruled out. The man making this claim is a self-described codebreaker and cold case consultant named Alex Baber, who runs an organization called Cold Case Consultants of America. Starting in December of 2025 and continuing through public presentations into early 2026, Baber announced that he had decoded Z13 using a combination of self-taught cryptography and what he has described as proprietary artificial intelligence software, and that the message resolved to a 13-character name, Marvin Merrill. Digging into historical records, Baber says he found that Marvin Merrill was an alias used by a man named Marvin Margolis, a former pre-med student and Navy medical corpsman. And then Baber's claim expanded considerably further. He says that decoding the second unsolved cipher, Z32, connects this same man to an entirely different, far older cold case, the 1947 murder of Elizabeth Short, the young Los Angeles woman whose horrific killing made her famous in the press as the Black Dahlia. The Short case is, in its own right, one of the most notorious unsolved murders in American history, predating the Zodiac killings by more than 2 decades. Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress, was found dead in a Los Angeles neighborhood in January of 1947, her body severed at the waist in a manner so shocking that it dominated newspaper coverage for months and turned her into a permanent fixture of American true crime lore. Los Angeles investigators worked through an enormous list of possible suspects at the time, reportedly as many as 22 names, considered seriously enough to appear before a grand jury and never charged anyone. The case has remained formally open for nearly 80 years. According to Baber, court records from that era show a man named Marvin Margolis actually appeared among those 22 names, and that Margolis had reportedly dated Short before her death. A claim Baber says he confirmed independently of the cipher work itself through separate historical and genealogical research. That is, to put it mildly, an enormous claim, and Baber has described his own confidence in it in equally enormous terms, telling one interviewer flatly that it is irrefutable and that it is mathematically impossible for the solution to point to anyone else. When a cold case researcher tells you a 55-year-old cipher and a 78-year-old murder are both mathematically impossible to interpret any other way, that is exactly the moment careful people should slow down rather than share the headline. Because here is the pattern this case keeps repeating, and it is worth walking through it plainly. This is not the first time in recent years that an independent investigator has announced with total confidence that the Zodiac case was finally closed. In 2021, a group calling itself the Case Breakers, led by a television producer turned cold case investigator, publicly named a different man entirely, a deceased Air Force veteran named Gary Francis Post as their suspect. They presented what they described as a substantial body of circumstantial evidence, a paint-splattered wristwatch they believed was purchased on a military base, a boot print they said matched a military-style boot, hair strands they claimed matched evidence recovered from a victim, and testimony from roughly 20 people who reportedly knew Post and found the theory credible. The group later announced they had located what they called an evidentiary, a gold mine tied to Post, generating another fresh round of headlines. It generated a wave of coverage nearly identical in tone to the ones circulating now. Zodiac Killer identity finally revealed. Ran in more than one outlet, and the story picked up enough cultural traction that it even became fodder for jokes among sitting United States senators about an old internet meme unrelated to the actual suspect. And yet, in the years since, no law enforcement agency ever confirmed the identification. Several independent Zodiac researchers who had spent decades on the case publicly picked apart the strength of the circumstantial evidence, arguing that a purchased watch and a common boot size fell well short of the forensic standard needed to close a serial murder case, and the FBI's San Francisco field office, when asked directly, gave the same answer it has given for every proposed suspect for decades. The investigation remains open. No charges, no official identification, no DNA match publicly confirmed to any crime scene evidence. Notice what both of these headline-generating claims, 4 years apart, actually have in common, because the pattern is the real story here, arguably more interesting than either individual name. Both were announced by independent investigators or organizations operating outside standard law enforcement channels, working with proprietary or undisclosed methodology rather than the fully transparent, peer-reviewable process that solved the Z13 cipher. Both leaned heavily on circumstantial connections, an alias here, a suspect list appearance there, a claimed physical resemblance rather than the kind of forensic evidence that actually closes a homicide case in a courtroom, DNA matches, verified fingerprints, or a confession. Both generated a rapid wave of dramatic media coverage before any independent expert had a real opportunity to test the underlying work. And both were met almost immediately with the same measured, careful non-confirmation from the actual agencies still legally responsible for these cases. That is not proof either claim is wrong. Amateur investigators have occasionally beaten professional cold case units to real breakthroughs before. DNA genealogy work by outside researchers has cracked several long unsolved cases in the past decade, using methods police departments were initially slow to adopt. But there is a meaningful difference between an outside researcher who hands investigators verifiable, testable forensic evidence, and an outside researcher who hands the public a dramatic name attached to a cipher solution nobody else can independently check. And that last point deserves real scrutiny on its own, because the specific claim that AI cracked the code is doing a lot of persuasive work in the current story. And it is worth understanding what the phrase does and does not mean here. Unlike the Z13 solution, where the entire mathematical method was published, ours reviewed by other cryptographers and confirmed step by step by the FBI's own cryptanalysis unit, Baber's decoding of Z13 has been described as relying on proprietary software whose inner workings have not been made publicly available for other cryptographers to test. That distinction matters enormously in cryptography specifically, because ciphers this short are notoriously vulnerable to a well-known statistical trap. With a message only 13 characters long, there are an enormous number of possible short solutions a sufficiently flexible decoding method could produce, especially if that method is not constrained by the same rigorous published rules that a transparent process requires. Professional cryptographers have a name for this exact risk. The shorter and more ambiguous the ciphertext, the easier it becomes to find a technique that produces whatever answer you're looking for, without that answer being the one true. Unique solution. This is precisely why the community of researchers who spent 51 years and ultimately succeeded on Z340 built their reputation on showing their work openly, line by line, for other experts to challenge, rather than presenting a name and asking the public to trust the process behind it. It is also worth noting that David Orenchak, one of the 3 men who actually did successfully solve Z13 through years of transparent, peer-reviewed work, has spoken publicly in the past about how uneasy he feels watching each new wave of unverified suspect claims wash over the case, precisely because the real solving process he was part of took over a decade of open collaboration with other specialists to get right, and still, even then, produced no name at all. There is a second layer of skepticism worth applying here, too, one that has nothing to do with cryptography and everything to do with how historical documents like decades-old grand jury suspect lists actually work. Being named on a list of 22 possible suspects in a high-profile 1947 murder investigation is not, by itself, meaningful evidence of guilt. Major unsolved murder cases from that era routinely generated suspect lists containing dozens of names, drawn from tips, jealous exes, acquaintances with minor criminal records, and people who simply lived nearby, the overwhelming majority of whom were never seriously suspected of anything beyond having crossed paths with the victim at some point in her life. Appearing on such a list places someone in the same broad category as roughly 21 other men from the same era, most of whom clearly did not commit the murder. Treating that appearance as corroborating evidence for an entirely separate unverified cipher solution from a different case decades later is the kind of reasoning that feels compelling in a video essay and falls apart the moment an actual investigator or prosecutor tries to build a case file around it. None of this means Marvin Margolis was definitely not the Zodiac Killer. It means, specifically and only, that the current evidence for that claim has not been independently verified, has not been endorsed by the law enforcement agencies who would need to confirm it, and follows a documented pattern of similar claims in this exact case that generated identical headlines and did not hold up under closer examination. The Los Angeles Police Department, asked directly for comment on the Black Dahlia portion of this new theory, gave reporters the same one-line answer prosecutors have given about that 78-year-old case for decades. The investigation remains open. So where does that actually leave us? 55 years after the Zodiac's last confirmed letter arrived at a newspaper office in 1974, it leaves us in roughly the same place careful researchers have been for most of that time, holding real, verified physical evidence, 2 genuinely solved ciphers that never once contained a name despite the killer's own taunting promise that one of them might, 2 ciphers that remain legitimately unsolved to this day, and a long, recurring cycle of dramatic public claims that generate enormous attention before quietly failing to survive contact with independent scrutiny. Thousands of names have been floated as the Zodiac over the decades, some with genuinely compelling circumstantial cases behind them, and every single one has eventually run into the same wall. No confession, no forensic match that independent experts and law enforcement agencies are willing to stand behind publicly. Maybe that persistent gap is the most honest thing this case can teach us, more honest, in its own way, than any single dramatic name ever could. A killer who spent years performing for an audience, dropping hints, promising a name buried inside a puzzle, understood something about human curiosity that has outlived him by more than half a century. We want unsolved stories to have endings. We want the puzzle to finally open. And that desire is powerful enough that it keeps producing headlines proclaiming victory long before the actual evidence has earned one. Real forensic breakthroughs in cold cases do happen, and when they do, they tend to look remarkably unglamorous. Quiet DNA lab work, patient genealogical research, methodology published openly for other experts to pick apart before anyone gets to call it solved. What we have right now with the Marvin Margolis claim is not that. It is a compelling story built on real historical documents and a real, if contested, cipher solution, presented with a level of certainty the underlying process has not yet earned. The Zodiac case may well be solved again next year, by another name, with another wave of identical headlines, and the year after that too. Until an agency with the authority to actually close this case says otherwise, the honest answer to who the Zodiac Killer really was remains the same answer it has been since 1974. Nobody knows for certain. Not yet. So here's what I want to know from you. Given everything you just heard, does the Marvin Margolis theory feel more credible to you than the 2021 Gary Francis Post claim? Or does the pattern itself make you skeptical of any name announced this way? Drop your take below. I read everyone.